So thank you very much. We had a really wonderful team effort here, and I want to thank everyone that's listed here on the slides. Some of us are going to present. Some are calling in remotely. I believe that Teal Wicks, sorry if I said it wrong, is on the phone. Wykes is on the phone, and Husseini Manji was not able to join today, and I believe Andrew Brockmans and Richard Hobson are also not able to join. But I wanted to say that we'd have everyone introduce ourselves, and we'll go into the case study and follow on the discussion.
So, Matthew Hotopf, I'm a psychiatrist and epidemiologist based at King's College London.
Hi, I'm Vaibhav Narayan. I'm in data sciences in Janssen R&D.
Hi, I'm Amos Folarin. I work at the King's College London BRC, the Biomedical Research Centre, as a software developer.
And again, Francesca Cerreta from Scientific Advice at the EMA.
Teal, if you're able to introduce yourself, please go ahead.
Linda, I'll just mention this is Husseini. I'm also on the phone, okay?
Wonderful. Thank you, Husseini.
You're welcome.
All right. So I've got right here. All right, so we're going to be following the same format that you've seen for the other case studies, so I don't want to belabor the point here. But what I did want to mention is that you've seen this evidentiary framework criteria before, and this one is populated, and we're not going to go through it right now, but just to tell you about, we're a little bit different than the last study in that the technology used in this study wasn't developed specifically for the study, so that will be a difference that you'll hear about. We're going to be talking about primarily one context of use. This is the small d diagnosis context of use, also the monitoring that goes along with it, and a more aspirational goal is having these measures be an endpoint in major depressive disorders. And we're going to talk through each of the processes here, including the benefit risk and the level of evidence, and we're going to have the team introduce and tell you about the study, and then we have a set of questions we'd like to address as well as taking questions from the audience.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about RADAR-CNS. RADAR stands for Remote Assessment of Disease and Relapse, and it's a pre-competitive public-private partnership with about 23 different entities across Europe involved. And I guess it's a discovery project. I mean, this is a disclaimer in a sense that we're in a very different stage of development from the previous case study. And the motivation behind RADAR-CNS is actually trying to use remote measurement technologies across actually not just depression, but we're doing studies in epilepsy and MS, and we're using them to see what data are actually predictive or correlate with traditional outcomes. In a sense, we're casting a wide net. And I'm very conscious that I don't have a regulatory background, so we're beginning to kind of funnel our efforts into more specific contexts of use, but we start with a very broad set of goals. Not mentioned on this slide, but I hope which comes over, are our patients. And it was great hearing for the previous presentation about that absolutely critical relationship. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go on, but it is something we feel very strongly about and have tried to really develop. And the funding, one must always mention the funder. IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative, which is funded from the European Commission, has funded this program of work in collaboration with FPIA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. It's a very interesting and helpful mechanism for bringing together public-private partnerships in this pre-competitive space. And it really is about trying to tackle the big questions which face us in terms of developing drugs. So the statement of need. Now, I'm not going to labor the point about depression being a massive public health problem. I think people will know that already. It's a public health problem. It's very prevalent. It's associated with poor outcomes across a whole range of domains. It is often very much unmet need, both clinically, but also actually in terms of drug development. We're in an era where there have been very few novel medications for depression over 30 years. And in a sense, this is a market failure. We haven't progressed as much as we should. And in a sense, some of the points on this slide might be responsible for that. So you see on the left the DSM-5 criteria for depression, but the point is it's a diagnosis which is syndromal. There's no valid diagnostic biomarker, and it's a very heterogeneous set of conditions. So, for example, within the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, you can have sleep disturbance, but that could be increased sleep or decreased sleep. You can have appetite disturbance or weight change, but that could be increased or decreased. You can have increases or decreases in motor activity recognized by agitation or retardation. So there's a huge amount of diversity, and actually someone worked out that theoretically you could have more than 10,000 different combinations of symptoms and still come up with the same diagnosis. I mean, that's probably, from my position as a clinician, that feels a bit of a stretch, but it is certainly true that you've got a huge amount of diversity. Our traditional antidepressant trials have lumped all these types together, and in a sense, you then have a whole problem about signal-to-noise ratio and being able to detect signals coming out of something which may be efficacious, but is just lost in the noise of all this heterogeneity. And another point is that the methodology, and we'll come back to this, the whole assessment of depressive disorder is based essentially on self-report. It may be self-report which is filtered through a clinician, but it is still essentially self-report. And so you have infrequent intervals, clinic visits, whatever they might be, and of course they can be coloured by recall bias. So if you're thinking about how well you've been sleeping over the last 2 weeks, it may well be that your answer to that is influenced by how well you slept last night, what stresses and strains you're under right now, how you're feeling, rather than actually an accurate recall of your sleep over the last 2 weeks. So why depression then? I hope I've made that case, but also I guess depression we feel fits in a sort of sweet spot for these technologies. And one reason for that is that actually if you think about people with depression, and we've talked about some of the sort of limitations in our current assessments, but also in a sense you've got this massive public health need, you've got this lack of provision and sort of gap in terms of people's the availability of effective treatments, and a lot of the decisions which might be made off the back of remote measurement technologies are not kind of hyper-acute life and death decision making that we saw perhaps in management of blood sugar or cardiac medicine. It is actually much more a slow burn where you're actually making a decision which might trigger some kind of clinical encounter. It might trigger some kind of prompt to the individual. Going on to the slide's details, so I think we've mentioned about the outcome measurements and the problems about perception. The technologies, we are now able to measure some of the direct phenomena within depression. So sleep, reduced sociability, reduced physical activity, changes in mood, which one can do by pushing out notifications from a smartphone. Speech patterns actually seem to be very interesting and sensitive to depression, and cognitive function. These are all things which can be measured using remote measurement technologies, and one can then get something which is actually quantitative, more objective, and more continuous. So it enables this objective, passive, continuous measurement between clinic visits. Okay, so where are we coming to in terms of sort of developing the context of use? And we thought about this quite carefully for this meeting, actually, because we could have had a number of contexts of uses because we've actually developed a study with a very broad set of goals. But we thought one area of real interest is actually trying to tease apart that heterogeneity within depression. So can one actually start using this to define candidate stratifiers for randomized trials? And we have certain potential known stratifiers. So there's been a long literature of the difference between typical and atypical depression with reduced sleep appetite and weight loss, with atypical depression being increased appetites, weight and sleep. But also there are other potentials, for example, depression with pronounced insomnia and hyperarousal as a subtype, which may have a tractable sort of target for developing medications. And also, not just these pre-existing candidate stratifiers, but also identifying novel stratifiers from the data. So you can actually, given the multiplicity of data one can generate, you can actually start devising potentially a kind of data-driven classification, which might eventually lead to something more specific in terms of development. The second area of use, I guess, is around improving clinical endpoints for clinical trials. And this slide is deliberately provocative, so bear with me, and apologies if I offend regulators, but I think it's important. It came up yesterday somewhat in terms of this issue. We're essentially relying on outcome measurements which were devised several decades ago. I mean, the Hamilton rating scale for depression was 1960. I was not even a twinkle in my parents' eye at that time, you'll be glad to know. And this is a measurement where you essentially, the patient sees a clinician, and the clinician takes an assessment, does a kind of psychiatric assessment of their current symptoms, and then marks them using a fairly unstructured regime on a number of different domains, a number of different symptom domains. So the symptoms, you not only got this sort of the problem of recall of the individual patient, but you've also actually got it interpreted through the clinician, which it may be a good thing. It may be that provides an additional level of validity, but it may not be. It may be that actually the clinician is susceptible to a whole load of other biases as well. So there's no magic to the gold standards we have. In fact, they're not particularly golden, really. And I guess one of the issues is, and I think it is an issue we've heard about before, is what do you do where there is no ground truth? How do you actually how do we as a community actually start developing that more? And it's not a question of throwing everything out and starting from scratch. It's more a question of how do these digital technologies actually assist, develop, and help the process evolve. So I think I've already rehearsed many of these points, and so I'm going to move over that one. But come on to the context of use slide, which states more formally what I've been saying, I guess. So we're talking about two main contexts of use: one, patient stratification and selection, and looking at diagnostic and monitoring markers, and really thinking about the way in which the decisions are going to be used for drug development in terms of patient selection for phase 2 or 3 trials, or monitoring over time. And the second use statement around efficacy endpoints to demonstrate clinical benefit. And this context of use is marked as higher risk, and Vaibhav will talk a bit more about some of those issues. So those are really the kind of broad areas we're looking at. Now, when we're thinking about RADAR-CNS and the RADAR-MDD study, what we were doing was thinking about a huge range of digital technologies which could be informative about the state of someone with depression. So the study is, we'll look at the study design a bit more in a moment, but essentially the idea was, what can you get off a smartphone and a wearable device, and what of those data streams might be informative about the patient's state. We're using wearables which are available in the high street. So these are Fitbits, considered to be low-risk devices by FDA, and also a lot of effort being taken into the patient's account. So what we did was develop a platform for data ingestion. It's a plug-and-play platform, and this is work which Amos and his team have really led. It was about being able to take virtually any wearable device and smartphone, and being able to suck the information from those sensors into a platform called RADAR-Base, which is then used for being able to analyze, doing both real-time analysis and cold analyses, visualize, and store and extract data. So that's essentially, that was one essential component. It's an open source platform, and we had a very clear motivation for making it open source because we wanted to have a community develop and make this more sustainable. If you close things off, you effectively mean that the platform only lasts as long as the project, but actually by making it open source, we've been able to attract a lot more people in the mobile health field into this area, and we've got a number of projects off the back of the RADAR program which are using this. And then a whole array of patient involvement work which really is about trying to understand what the benefits patients might see from these technologies, what might be the barriers to implementation, and we did a number of focus groups across 3 different countries with 3 different conditions, systematic reviews, surveys, and we're now in the process of doing discrete choice experiments in terms of what are the trade-offs? What do people actually prefer? Are you willing to give up a bit of privacy in order to have this element of disease management handled better, etc.? The focus groups are very informative in terms of our study design. They told us things, for example, like actually one of the interesting things was that people were much less concerned about privacy than we thought they would be, but they were much more concerned about issues, for example, of stigma. Particularly the epilepsy population were very concerned about having a device which sort of shouted out and made it obvious about their condition. And usability was really a very high priority for many of our patients, as one might expect. And then we went through a process of device selection. So I said already we chose a Fitbit for the major depressive study, Fitbit Charge, but this wasn't something we just picked, as it were, in the high street. We engaged patients in a string of studies which looked at what their trade-offs would be. And it's partly about us specifying what our requirements were. And of course, there are disadvantages in having something which in some ways the algorithms are closed off. It's more difficult to, you're not getting raw data, but there are benefits because this is, it's relatively cheap. You're able to get, it's very tried and tested technology. It's technology which many people use anyway. It doesn't draw attention to the patient. But this was a whole process of device selection, which is now in press with the JMIR. And then the study design. The point about the study was really putting these devices on individuals. Because we recognized actually the digital divide, which Jenna talked about yesterday, we were very keen not to leave people without smartphones off the project. So we provided smartphones for people who didn't have one. And we follow people over a 2-year period. In fact, we've just extended that because the study has taken a bit longer to collect the data, and we had the opportunity to keep going. And we had participants coming at the end of 2 years asking to stay on the study because they liked it. This is one of the kind of main ideas about the study, is actually to determine whether people will engage in a study of this nature over that period of time. Because if we're doing this in real life and making clinical decisions off the back of it, you need to have people being engaged again for much longer actually than 2 years, for potentially many years. So it's a very busy slide, but the point about this is that you have at the top there in red clinical assessments which are done every 3 months. I say clinical assessments, they're actually done remotely. But we're using depression rating scales which are widely used in research practice, and a number of other outcome measurements, and also the contextual variables seen in the purple box on the bottom to see what had happened, what's changed in people's lives, and also service utilization. And then in grey, you have the passive data, which just streams off these devices all the time, data on activity, GPS, on sleep-wake cycles, and so forth. And then the other different coloured components are basically active remote measurement technologies where we're asking people to do a task. So we asked them to do a PHQ, which is a brief questionnaire on depression every 2 weeks, trying to get a sort of higher temporal resolution to defining our relapses or remissions in the course of the 2 years. And we're also looking at specific tasks, for example, speech and cognitive assessments, which are done less frequently over the course of the study. And just to give you an indication of what you actually end up seeing, this is just a very high-level look at adherence over the course of about 2 years. And what you see at the start, at the far left of that, is the new people coming onto the study, and each row is effectively an individual. And what you'd want to see is a solid, more or less solid blue line for each individual, indicating perfect adherence. What you actually see is a much more checkered pattern, and we have a period you can probably just about make out about halfway across, or slightly more to the left, where there's a period of relative absence of data coming in. This was an issue about a technological issue about notifications, and we changed the system, and then the adherence luckily improved. But you have those kind of technological challenges as you're going through the process of running a study of this kind. I can say that we have, at 1 year, very high participation, over 80% of people staying in the study over that period of time. And in terms of the sort of active measurements, we're getting about 60% of those coming through at the moment. So, you know, adherence, which has been was rock bottom, has really climbed very effectively over the time. I'm going to hand over to Vaibhav now.
Thank you, Matthew. And if I may add that that the adherence on devices and the passive data is higher. So overall, I think we are very, very happy with the adherence profile in this real-world study. And I'm going to just go forward and speak a little bit about the specific context of use and the data that we are collecting, etc., and hopefully bring up some points that are relevant to the discussions yesterday and today. This slide, just to remind that the data in these real-world studies has a long journey, starting from people's wrists and their sensors is processed in many different ways, transmitted, and eventually received, and then that's the beginning of another journey in terms of qualification, validation, and eventual use in clinical trials. And this, I think, is somewhat unique to digital phenotyping and digital biomarkers. As Matthew said, that RADAR as a program was not really designed to be a qualification study. It's a real-world study and a signal-finding study. And what we expect to do is to forward translate from the RADAR studies to develop evidence-based digital health solutions for clinical practice. For example, in major depression, can we predict relapse? Can we track depression? In epilepsy, can we detect seizures? In MS, can we really quantify fatigue and disability in patients in a way that's meaningful to both patients and physicians? But we also hope to, what I would call, reverse translate from these RADAR studies to develop better endpoints and patient stratification biomarkers for drug development and clinical trials. And personally, I feel that starting from a real-world study like RADAR is actually not a bad place to start. Because, just for example, a patient selection digital biomarker for clinical trials could be a companion diagnostic of tomorrow in the real world. And we have to have something that will actually be acceptable to patients in clinical practice. Likewise, an efficacy endpoint being used in clinical trials could be used for real-world efficacy monitoring in clinical practice. And we have to think about how patients will then deal with this technology in the real world. And we do believe that the RADAR type studies already sort of front loads this process of understanding patient acceptance and the viability of these technologies in the real world. On this slide, one of the points I want to make is that when it comes to digital endpoints and readouts, we do live in a modular world. And if you take truly a patient-centric view of the world, not just you're a clinical trial subject, at the end of the day, you have one wrist on which you're willing to wear a wearable. Very few people want to wear a wearable on both their wrists. And most of the time you are able to, you want to carry one smartphone, right? And I think the responsibility that we have is that from the data streams coming from this scenario, what's the maximum amount of information that we can receive? Many of the patients have multiple comorbidities. In fact, one of the studies in the RADAR program is multiple sclerosis patients who have also a diagnosis of major depression. And I think one thing that we want to always think about is how do you maximally reuse the data that you have the privilege of collecting from a patient to get maximal disease insights for that patient. And really what we cannot have is a study phone for MS and a study phone for major depression and a study wearable for MS and another wearable for major depression. So we do want to think modular, and in fact in the RADAR program we have a whole effort to harmonize and make sure that we are collecting similar types of data from different disease populations and are developing common frameworks for analyzing these data. And so what this particular slide shows is that at the lowest level, you're collecting raw data from sensors, right? From that, you may derive some low-level features that are of general interest, like actigraphy, speech features, respiratory acoustics, heart rate variability, oxygen saturation, skin conductance, etc. From that, you might develop a layer of a higher level markers, right? You may get an understanding of psychomotor retardation, sleep structure, respiration, physiological stress, etc. And from these high level markers, you could derive some disease level insights, whether you're trying to identify a patient subtype, whether you're trying to predict an event, or whether you're trying to monitor efficacy. And I think we'll get into this hopefully in the panel discussion. Our hope is that the lowest layer could essentially be plug and play, bring your own device. At the end of the day, there are big companies like Apple and Google, et cetera, who are investing a lot of money provisioning devices, making them usable, and we have to be able to collect data from these devices. Then, of course, the next level is the processing, the feature extraction, and data management, which RADAR-Base is doing in our studies, and we believe, yes, that will have to be regulated and in a fit-for-purpose way. And then finally, we have algorithms that derive insights from these low-level features. And these, of course, will be iterative and will change and learn as we deploy these algorithms over time. And I know it's already been talked about how do you sort of regulate and validate iterative algorithms. And then, like I said, at the highest level, we will have sort of disease-level insights. And what I don't show here is that the platform that we use to collect and process and manage the data can also be then reused as a dashboard to give insights back to clinicians and physicians, which we believe is actually an important part of this entire virtuous cycle that we are trying to build. So, I will now sort of quickly go into some of the benefit assessments of patient stratification. I think some of it is obvious. Clearly, we have a strong need to develop medicines in major depression for specific subtypes. If we don't have a good way of identifying subtypes, we always recruit general MDD patients, and that's not been very helpful, for example. how would it impact? And I think when I already made the point, and I think technically speaking, if there is a novel way by which you randomize patients into a clinical trial, you're obliged to develop it as a companion diagnostic in the future, and that's something that we have to be mindful of. From an efficacy endpoint perspective, again, I think Matthew already made the point that our current sort of ways of measuring efficacy are very subjective and often noisy. And one area where we also hope to see improvements by having more quantitative and potentially digital endpoints is that we may see a lower placebo response and sort of in these populations, given these endpoints. Of course, that will have to be shown. We sort of hope to take a progressive approach. Initially, these patient selection markers, suppose you're selecting MDD patients with hyperarousal and insomnia, would be used in exploratory phase, earlier stage studies and eventually in phase 3 trials as well. But I do want to sort of point out some of the benefits of digital measures to select patients or to monitor efficacy, which may be more general. And some of them we have already talked about in previous settings, that we do believe that at some level these measures might be more ecologically valid. They are, after all, sort of collected as patients go about their daily lives. We also think that the same measures that we use in clinical trials could then be used later on for monitoring real-world impact and real-world efficacy of these medications, given that these are patient-centric technologies that can continue to be used outside clinical trial settings. And of course, we hope that this will lead to smaller clinical trials with better power to detect signals. There are, of course, risks. There are risks both for not having such approaches, and there are also risks in implementing such approaches, which are highlighted here. The ones that I want to potentially maybe speak to a little bit are the ones towards the bottom of this slide. Of course, you can have a novel way of selecting patients, right, which goes beyond just asking somebody, for example, do you have a sleep disorder along with your depression, or giving them a quick, insomnia severity index scale. You could have a more objective sort of digital way of selecting these patients, which may be more predictive of response. But then, of course, if that's the case, then could these technologies, or will these technologies actually be used in the real world to select patients? And if so, what sort of burden would it place on certain subsets of the population, given the issues of digital divide, where some strata of the society may not have access to these devices. And of course, another sort of general issue that comes up in using digital measures to make objective measurements is that what's the interplay between measuring something objectively versus the subjective experience of the patient themselves, right? And of course, we know the right answer. The right answer is that they both should go together and they strengthen each other. But in reality, I think there is still an open question that we should not discount how a person is actually feeling. And fatigue is a good example, right? You can try to measure fatigue many different ways, but if a patient feels that they are fatigued, then they are fatigued, right? And it's inherently a perception of the patient. Having said that, even if we had fatigue as a self-perceived sort of item, by having contextual information about how physically active they are, how much they are moving around, we can get a much better idea of their overall fatigue. If somebody is fatigued and not moving around, that's a very different scenario than if they're fatigued and they're physically very active, for example. So I do think, and this is something that we are looking very closely in RADAR-CNS, the interplay between objective measures and subjective measures, and the interplay between patient voice and passivity, so to speak. I think in the context of this particular context of use that we have, which is being able to select an MDD subpopulation with hyperarousal and insomnia. We do believe that, there's a reason why I think we went for this context of use. We do believe that there is a reasonable amount of prior information on how some of the digital measures may correspond to the phenotype that we are trying to select. For example, we know that sleep, which is currently sort of clinically measured by, for example, insomnia severity index, we know what the digital counterparts for measuring sleep are. We could sort of get to high-level sleep from actigraphy data. We could get to much more of a sleep architecture by combining actigraphy with heart rate and respiratory rate, et cetera. And so we do believe that there is, prior art and evidence on being able to measure different aspects of sleep. We also think that overall, there is an ability to measure hyperarousal through various digital technologies as well. When you especially start combining sort of autonomic nervous sort of readouts like heart rate variability, galvanic spin response, etc. But this is still something that will require more validation and correlation with traditional scales. The issue about the gold standard not being that golden notwithstanding. Of course, there are certain sort of aspects of hyperarousal like rumination and ruminative thoughts, which are much harder to capture digitally, but we expect that in the end it'll be a combination of well-placed self-reports and digital assessments in any case. So moving on, we've sort of talked about some of the, I just mentioned some of the underlying work that already exists that we can build upon. But of course, we are also aware that there are gaps in the current state of evidence that we do need to fill. We already talked about our need to correlate a lot of these emerging digital measures of various aspects of depression and hyperarousal with existing gold standards. There's a question mark next to the gold standards only because sometimes you can strive for perfect correlation, and that actually may not be very helpful if your gold standard is not truly representative of what you're willing to measure. I think there is an overall issue of sensor collected data in terms of not understanding population norms and variabilities and various cutoffs. And of course, as we collect more and more data on more and more individuals and are able to sort of share these data, and this will certainly help. But I do want to sort of mention in passing that perhaps in these types of diseases, waxing and waning, like major depression, where you have prodromal periods of wellness punctuated by exacerbations and relapses, the best norm, so to speak, is the patient themselves. And we do believe that longitudinal assessment is the key in these situations. So I think Matthew already mentioned the slide around the technology validation and verification piece. I just want to point out that we have a very nice platform which serves also as a dashboard. We are collecting all of these data streams that we mentioned, sometimes episodically and sometimes continuously over time. Here is an example of the dashboard. We are able to look at GPS location data, Bluetooth handshakes, all sorts of Fitbit readouts, and monitor it in real time, extract features, and are able to analyze these data. I think I've kind of covered some or all of these issues before. Obviously, the overall sort of requirements depends on the context of use. The context of use around patient stratification and monitoring may be somewhat more lower risk. The context of use around efficacy monitoring might have more stringent requirements. And with that, I guess we come to this last slide around Evidentiary Criteria Framework, the MDD case study. It's a busy slide. I will leave it up here for now, and then we can move on to this slide, which I'll pass back to Linda.
Thanks very much. Wanted to just reference that in terms of alignment of what fits within the Evidentiary Criteria Framework and what doesn't. So you've heard a very nice description of what's happening in this study in terms of identifying individuals with insomnia and hyperarousal. So the underlying constructs can be measured and showed promise for differentiating typical and atypical depression and depression with anxiety and other symptoms such as agitation or insomnia. It's also a discovery-based study that will identify new stratifiers or constructs from the data-driven approach that they're undertaken, with the additional measures that are being measured with speech activity, sociability, affectivity, reactivity, et cetera. What we felt, and we've heard from other case studies during this meeting, is what's really missing from the evidentiary criteria is the patient voice, the patient endpoint. Particularly for this study in the beginning, in the selection of the devices and the things that are being measured and the frequency of data collection, both passive and active. But you've heard from all the other studies that it's important to have patient input and voice throughout the entire process from beginning to end. So that's something that we would really like to strongly recommend be incorporated into the evidentiary criteria structure for digital health technologies. So we now like to move into the panel discussion, and we've teed up a couple of questions, well, actually quite a number of questions that we'd like to discuss. So we'll start with these. It came up in this and other, the lack of reliable and valid ground truth, objective measures versus subjective experience, explainability versus performance. How should we think about that? The iterative process for open source, I think that's a question that we really would like to get to, is how do we think about what's needed as the software or the data that's being collected from the devices, if there's changes in both the devices or the smartphones, how do you iterate on that and move forward as quickly as possible, and then separating the data collection from hardware from the algorithms and disease insight. So I'd love to hear from you, Steve.
I think Chris was there first.
Okay, Chris.
I just wanted to caution, I know that companion diagnostics was mentioned in a couple of the slides. At least as I understand from the presentation, this would not meet the criteria for companion diagnostics, so I wouldn't recommend you go somewhere you don't need to go.
Thank you.
I had a question for the panel. So in the last talk, we heard about an association between stride velocity and day of the week. In your talk here now, we heard about an association between a UI change and adherence. Both of those findings seem to rely a little bit on serendipity of a good data scientist looking for something in the data. I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on sort of a more systematic approach to finding confounders, given how complicated humans are in the real world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good question, particularly since we believe that at some level, a sudden and unexplained lack of adherence to these devices itself might be a signal about, especially in the case of depression, as a disease. And I think that our approach to this, of course, the obvious answer is that we are trying to keep track of as many confounders as possible. But even as I say these words, I know that we don't know what we don't know. I think our ultimate inoculation that we seek about this is to passively collect data for a period of time from an individual. And I use the word passive because then that reduces burden, such that we are able to train our algorithms over a longitudinal data set and really understand all the variations that happen within an individual for various reasons and model changes over and above that. And we do believe that approach would sort of help us take care of these confounds. Of course, the cost will be that we cannot interpret very small changes, but hopefully we will still be able to identify those subset of the data that are more robust to these confounds. And we have already mentioned that we see this as more as a discovery study where we're collecting a lot of different readouts. And what we will find is that there are certain types of data streams, and within even a particular modality, certain types of features that are more robust to disease state changes and less sort of confounded by day-to-day variations. And I think we already see where even in an actigraphy stream, right? For example, how many steps you walk in a day or when you go to sleep, that time would be, much more sort of impacted by outside influences. But the actual sleep fragmentation pattern while you're sleeping is going to be a little bit more robust to the actual disease we are measuring. So I think all these things are things we will look and track, but eventually we hope that a long-term data would sort of at least help us understand these variabilities and confounds, and that will be part of the learnings from this particular project.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, there is a degree of serendipity here, where I think, as Matthew alluded to, we're casting the net as wide as we possibly can. So we've opportunistically collected as many data types as we can in the project, and that's has some challenges in terms of confounders. I guess we want to understand as much about the variability of kind of individual. We looking cross-sectionally, I think it's going to be quite challenging. I think to sort of draw out kind of the common thread between various subtypes of depression, if there is in fact some common theme between them.
So do you envision sort of pre-specifying the look for confounders, or do you just treat it as big data, throw it at an expensive computer, and see what correlations come out?
I suspect it's a bit of both. I mean, I think that it is the question of the known knowns and the known unknowns, and I think that. I think you can pre-specify the things you could hypothesize were going to be useful, likely confounders. I can tell you that my sleep architecture has fallen away somewhat since travelling across the Atlantic, and that's so. And actually, building on Vaibhav's point about this sort of individualized traces, you can get the contextual data from the passive data being collected. So, if I've got GPS, I can identify the fact that I've travelled. But I think I think we're at the start of a very complex journey. I mean, I know that's a bit of a cop-out as an answer, but I think that it is a question of putting together some logical, clearly kind of somewhat common sense ideas, like the kind of variation in activity over the course of a week, and then exploring the data using a more big data approach.
Yeah, and a couple of points. We are trying to collect as much contextual information as possible. Sometimes passively, we know the weather, where you were, we know if you were traveling, etc. And the other general point I want to make is that by its very nature, the digital readouts can provide a lot of sensitivity, but do not necessarily provide the specificity for a particular disease state. And I think the one approach is to use a combination in an adaptive way of digital data to detect certain anomalies, and then go in with more clinically validated self-reports to confirm those anomalies, or to zero in on more sort of target assessments. And we do believe by combining digital data and clinical scales that are validated at a population level, we will get a nice mixture of both sensitivity and specificity, which is often what we need, and we'll be able to at least weed out some of the confounds at a later confirmatory stage. I think, as Matthew said, one advantage we do have is that often it's a question of prediction and preemption. So we have a sort of an escalating funnel, right? We don't have to make an instant snap decision at any given point of time where the chances of being wrong are higher.
Thank you.
Chris?
So I can certainly understand the advantages of the open source approach towards creating the platform. Is there an opportunity, and I'm not a technologist, to lock down the platform at a given point in time and have it not change during the course of the data collection for clinical trial? Because that's one of the things around measurement that we're very sensitive to around interpretation of data. And it'd be interesting if Francesca, from an EMA perspective, if you guys also have thoughts on that.
go first.
Okay, so yeah, the open source was also one of my points as well. The other point was for possibility to be accessed by an authorized party, particularly if the data then need to be used for regulatory use and how the GCPs would be fulfilled as well. And we haven't considered that yet. I mean, we just had some preliminary discussions with them, and perhaps it's something that will come up in the follow-ups.
So, I mean, as the platform is open sourced, we release sort of, periodic versions of that will be locked down. It gets a little bit more difficult with the mobile applications. We tend to have a kind of canonical version of that. It's all open source. If you want to build your own version of one of the apps, that's also a possibility. I mean, I guess in a kind of more extreme version, you can take, it's all under Apache 2 license. So if you were, a company developing a application based on top of RADAR-base, and you wanted to take that off, out of the kind of public domain, you could do that. That's an option as well.
Yeah, hello. I used to be a European regulator. I've been sitting in scientific advice with Francesca for 5 years, and among my roles I also reviewed projects for IMI, which is the funding body. And there are at least 3 or 4 projects that take a similar approach, that is an agnostic approach, use devices to try to track disease in time. And as a psychiatrist that I am, I think this is absolutely, a great effort to try to create digital phenotyping of very, very heterogeneous populations. I can think of autism, there's a similar project as yours. There's depression certainly is an unmet need. And, but on the other end, this raises huge regulatory problems. So on the one side, these projects have milestones for regulatory submission. Sometimes in 2-3 years, you have to go to the scientific advice to ask for regulatory well, at least discussion advice. But on the other hand, there's no thoughts on what could be the regulatory issues raising from digital phenotyping. For instance, just the labeling. I mean, like, how do we label digital phenotyping? Is it something that by any means we can translate into something that has a biological value to which we can target a treatment? When I studied, I recently studied at the FDA in a reviewer division, and then I couldn't imagine how many sponsors actually come to us with products for these disorders that target subdomains. For many reasons, one is commercial reason, but others are just to try to target treatments that are biologically specific. But there seems to be no communication between these 2 words. So this trying to make these huge efforts to develop digital phenotyping and then eventually come and develop a product which is based on a rating scale that is absolutely inefficient, but pretends to target a biological domain. So.
Well, we hope to create a sort of a big dialogue with the regulators and really go through the process. I think I should add, as Matthew said in the beginning, that the current RADAR-CNS scope is signal finding, feasibility, patient acceptance, and really creating an algorithm. And depending on how the performance metrics of this algorithm goes, we will subsequently take it through regulatory qualification, although we are, thanks to, EMA's Innovative Task Force, we are having some early dialogue with them about where we could go. There's another sister study of radar in Alzheimer's. We're developing a functional endpoint, and again, we have made very clear that within this time, we will be able to do some limited time assessments, but identify the functional digital readouts that are most associated with functional decline in Alzheimer's, and if that looks good, then we will do a prospective qualification and validation study. So hopefully, even though regulatory qualification is not strictly in scope of this project as it stands today. Hopefully, our goal is that this is not it's not going to be disjointed, that we will have a lot of early advice, early engagement, and as was mentioned previously, hopefully that will mean is that when we actually go through the process, it will be a lot more efficient and quicker, and we'll make up time there.
And just further to this as well, this is sort of a pre-competitive space. There are industrial partners on this project as well as academic, and I think if there is going to be a discussion about how we have that sort of that making that data available for kind of wider uses, that's something we're very interested in. It seems that the value of the data collected in RADAR will likely outlast the 5 years of the project, and that's something again that similarly with the platform, we see the sort of scope of that as wider.
Hi everyone. I swear to you, I'm not ganging up on you with the previous commenter, but it's definitely a question in a similar line. And very specifically, there's another IMI project called ID Fast that just started with very similar goals. I mean, the overall goal there is digital measures of sleep and fatigue for immune-mediated inflammatory diseases and neurodegenerative diseases. But the premise is exploratory in nature, like let's try a bunch of devices, let's see which ones patients like, and at the same time work on biomarkers that we can derive from the data that those devices can measure. So the premise is very similar. And the idea of this exploratory work and how it connects to something like an actual regulatory roadmap to a validated digital biomarker or endpoint as you pointed out yourself, it is exploratory in nature and might not be compatible, but all these projects always put these very lofty goals front and center because, well, they kind of have to, I guess, to some extent. But my question then is, particularly from your experience actually having gone through this and a lot of other IMI projects popping up that follow similar reasonings and similar workflows, like if you could go back 3-4 years in time, 2-3 years I think it is right now, what would be the thing that you do differently in your initial phase where you're working on selecting devices with the knowledge that you have now in the ways that people interact with them and that you interact with them as the people working with the data that they generate?
I would say that, in fact, you're pointing to one of the strengths of our current project. I think we feel actually very good about the process we have been through in selecting the devices, selecting the technologies. We feel very good about the way we have involved the patients. And I think it's bearing out in the level of adherence that we are getting. We are pursuing relatively long-term studies following patients in MDD for 2 years, for example, and even our MS study is fairly longitudinal. And I think we will have a lot of learning in terms of how you select devices, how you provision technology, what are the barriers, what are the adherence issues. And I think that part, we can already say that part of the study is going to be successful, right? In terms of developing digital biomarkers, I think we are, that time will tell. We're just now beginning to analyze some of the interim data that's coming through, and we are actually fairly hopeful there as well. Related to your other questions, the idea fast I'm very familiar with. Janssen is actually, co-leading that study as well. I think it more speaks to the broad need of developing objective sort of digital endpoints in a range of diseases, and we picked out fatigue and sleep in immune-mediated diseases and neurodegenerative diseases, because what we found in our clinical studies in these diseases were that patients cared less about the clinical endpoints that exist today, which talk about morning stiffness and pain, and cared much more about certain endpoints like fatigue and mood. And we felt like we needed some novel measures which could be qualified, and that's a step in that direction. And I know that there are, the previous panel was a terrific example of taking an endpoint all the way through, and I think there are other projects going on, for example, taking something very specific like mobility or and taking it through the full process. I think we have an approach where we are doing more broad-based phenotyping, and we will have, like I said, multiple insights that we could take in different directions. Some could be all the way for clinical trial development tools, others could be more clinical practice tools, some could be self-management tools. An important part of RADAR is also getting input from physicians and clinical care pathways about how they would interact with these technologies and how these technologies would fit with clinical care pathways. So it really is looking forward in that direction. And we already know that if the physician is involved in these types of digital assessments, the level of patient engagement and adherence is much, much higher. So another important point is that we don't see these digital technologies as in any way getting between the patient and the physician, but in fact, strengthening that therapeutic alliance. And those are some of the learnings that we are confirming in these studies, and we hope to bring forward in a way that will be helpful across the board.
I can also speak for the device selection side of this. What would we potentially want, ideally? In fact, actually, Fitbit wasn't our first choice of device. It was the Pebble 2, and you know. We were so we before we were able to kind of fully evaluate that device. We'd actually integrated that into the platform, and at that point in time, it got taken off the market. I mean, when we get asked in the sort of device selection process, what people are, what do you want out of this? They always want raw data. So it's as a sort of as a little bit of a kind of wrench between going for something like Fitbit, where you have a pretty well a black box that spits out a value of sleep or a number of steps counted, versus getting the accelerometer and PPG off the device.
Great, thanks. So we'd like to move to the next set of...
I think Francesca
sorry.
It's all right.
Francesca.
It wasn't in answer to this point, so go ahead. No, go ahead.
Are you sure?
Okay. No, I just wanted to make a couple of comments because I find it fascinating and potentially very useful to look at this broad set of symptoms and see, whether it is possible to define depressive populations as subsets depending on the basis of these symptoms. On the other hand, I'm thinking of the example of fibromyalgia. We don't have any drugs authorized in Europe for fibromyalgia. And what's the reason? Because then when you come with a medicine for that, you are told, oh, no, the effect is mainly antidepressive. Oh, no, the effect is mainly antalgic. So it was almost like it wasn't a recognized condition. So you're trying here to subset depressive patients who have sleep disturbances. So working backwards from whatever claim will be done, here it will be like treatment of sleep disturbance in depressed patients, perhaps, if it comes to a claim where you're testing your methodology for a drug. Or if it is a claim on overall depression, you will sooner or later come head to head with those gold standards that are gold standard by reason of having been used for 50 years. But these are the yardstick against which all drugs on the market have been approved, unfortunately.
Thank you. So we just have a few minutes left, but this question has been raised previously, but just to get back to it, how do we think about, or what's the process that we can follow to accommodate iterative changes in the technology that are on the open side, things, out of the control if you're using an existing, digital device and collecting real-world data and something changes with the data sources that are being provided to you, how do you take that into account without losing sort of the data that you've collected so far, and what do you do to keep moving, to iterate as the technology changes? So I'd really like to think about what would be the steps that not only this study, but any study could take that's using that kind of device as it changes over time.
Yeah. And if I may just sort of elaborate on Linda's question, because I think it's an important one. One regime that we hope we can get to is that the actual device that a patient wears might well be a commercially available device, right? And so necessarily we cannot control the inside hardware of the device. But we can sort of have a data contract with that device whereby we can always have APIs to the device that, and some diagnostic test that we are getting the data that is the right input for our algorithms. So can there be that separation between the commercial grade device on the patient's wrist and the rest of the sort of system that we have and the algorithm, and with some sort of a data contract, and as long as that is satisfied, we can let the commercial device be plug and play. And then, of course, the next question is what happens as the algorithm itself evolves and learns with more data.
Yeah, I think just add a tiny sort of a bit extra to this. I mean, something that's caught us out a few times in the sort of engineering of a platform is relying on something like an Android OS, and we're to some extent that's outside of our control. If we were to take something that made use of that in a regulatory context, maybe not in the context of RADAR-CNS, but if we wanted to evaluate something that made use of something running on top of Android, how would something a regulatory body look at view that lack of control? We're essentially at the mercy of when Google feels like releasing a change. And those changes can be pretty substantial. The way, for example, in which the study we're using here runs for a long period of time. GPS, for example, has changed the way that's been reported by the Android platform. So I think this is quite a critical question for anyone planning on using a mobile device.
I mean, the use of controls and the continuous monitoring platforms you guys have put forward, in a way, any given patient is their own control. So if you're looking at a change of time within a given patient based on serial monitoring, a sort of naive placebo group, quote unquote, is probably less important depending on the context of use.
Right. No, thanks for that. And so would we say that in the end we are sort of more interested in the data that we are collecting and the characteristics of those data and how we derive insights from it? And if over time, as we are following a patient, the back-end sort of hardware, the consumer device, if that changes, but we are still able to verify that the data being outputted is the correct input for our algorithm, would that be acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, this gets to my open source earlier question. In part, when there's a evolution of the measurement technology, generally we do some type of bridging in a limited fashion as one opportunity. In this case, because the sensors and things are changing at such a vast rate, I think one of the speakers yesterday mentioned that based on the hertz of the phone, the readouts were dramatically different. And so in those cases, that's where I was recommending that if you can lock down the technology, even if you're locking it down for a patient, so that for that patient, during whatever time frame the technology is not changing, that could be of help.
So I think that's the core problem here is for some parts of the kind of apparatus we have, you can do that. We're in control of the kind of versioning of that. There are some parts of that that are simply we're not going to go and build a mobile phone operating system. It's not feasible. That's Can you envisage using something that changes every 6 months, and people are going to update their phones? Is that a viable proposition?
But to your point, have a bridging experiment that satisfies that the data quality is still fit for purpose for our algorithm,
Or that it doesn't change your readout or interpretation.
Right. Yep.
With apologies to our colleagues from the Device Center, perhaps we can borrow some engineering language and think about critical quality attributes for what we're talking about here. So perhaps the critical quality attribute is not whether we're on Android 8 or Android 8.1, but rather the specifics of the data. Does it average? Does it drop the high-low value? And so thinking about it at a more granular level and thinking about what's actually critical to the quality of what we're measuring might be more instructive for us to think about.
Right.
Jennifer, do you have thoughts on this as a technologist? I mean, again, we are not those folks. How would you think about this?
So, Chris, you've made my day. I've never been described as a technologist before. You know,
More so than me.
I have serious concerns about locking anything down. I think much of the purpose of updating technologies out in the wild is actually security patches, and I think that's really important. I also think that you made some really good points about having a pre-negotiated agreement with the organization. The example from yesterday during Empower was about actually changing the whole handset, that you could continue the installation of an app on a whole new generation of handsets. If someone's got the same wearable technology, you know, oftentimes there will be a software update, and then it's very easy to verify whether it still meets your performance specifications. In fact, every time a technology manufacturer does do that, they do indeed make that verification specification sheet available. I was going to say 9 times out of 10. I would be making them up. I have no idea how often it happens. But the point is, you should be able to evaluate whether any updates that have been provided have actually altered the quality of the information you need. And so it needs to be fit for purpose. Maybe something is shipped that does alter it, and that, you know, causes a question. You might have to do some, you know, repeat your analytical validation on a subset of the data. It may still hold anyway, it may not. But I think I don't think the first step should be locking down the technology. I also think that as long as it's meeting your needs, either through a pre-negotiated agreement that ensures that, or being able to use the verification specifications to say, yes, it's still fit for purpose, we're still able to run our algorithm on this and it's still accurate and correct.
That's fair. I mean, the big question is to look, not just assume that whatever the update is doesn't affect your interpretation.
And I will go back to all of the work that was published in Nature this week, saying that actually the commercial technologies are performing incredibly well in terms of accuracy, especially across different populations compared to the medical device technologies, and I was shocked to see that, but I think, you know, that's, you know, breaking news within the last 3 days, and we need to take that seriously.
I will not reveal the name of the company, but a major medical device and commercial manufacturer, a senior person there once told me that our least updated and least user-friendly technologies and medical devices used for clinical trials, because there is absolutely no pressure to update it. You are obliged to use it, and there is no large sort of consumer pressure to sort of make it more usable. And our best technology and the best research in terms of human interaction interface and ease of use and measurement and whatnot goes into our commercial devices, because people have a choice there. They can switch out of them.
So I have a question on your first term, because everybody uses algorithm with a different intended meaning. So in the qualification space, because of the transparency provisions, one of the things that we've brought forward is that if it's a complex readout, you know, a composite biomarker, for instance, that the algorithm needs to be shared with us, because then that way we know that with a different technology or a different platform, whether or not that algorithm still holds based on performance characteristics. So in this case, is this something that can be written down, or is the algorithm code, or what is the algorithm?
I think this is a good question. I think what we owe you in return of having a device agnostic sort of environment is to have an algorithm that's device agnostic, right? Because I think there's a fine line between data processing at the low level and then combining those features and doing machine learning to actually make a prediction. And I think one of our goals is to have a machine learning algorithm that can take input from any device as long as it has certain specifications. To answer your question, and this is, I think, one of the questions we had in a previous slide, that it's quite possible that the data are fairly multimodal with fairly complex set of features. Imagine speech features being combined with, you know, actigraphy data, for example. And we believe that sometimes the best performance, however you define performance, suppose you're trying to predict an event, might come from a deep learning neural net algorithm which inherently is not explainable. I mean, we can tell you what the algorithm is, we can give you the code, but you cannot interpret which feature is driving the performance of this algorithm in a straightforward way. But it might give you more performance, better predictive power. From a patient's perspective, I care about more accurate predictions, or maybe even from a physician's perspective. But on the other hand, there is some comfort in the explainability. So I think this trade-off between explainability and performance, and we see that all the time. We sometimes see more explainable algorithms actually having less performance than less explainable algorithms. And that trade-off there is, I think, an interesting one with different stakeholders involved. And we hope to sort of maybe push this with our results going forward.
I wonder if I can build on that a little bit, and I think you mentioned it during your talk as well, the idea of trying to think about this being a bit modular. I think that's really important to think about a variety of different technologies that may be able to meet the performance specifications that you require. And thinking about, evaluating that performance as one step, and then, thinking about the processing of that data to give some kind of meaningful measure. And then, even going back to the session this morning, Luca was asking great questions about, and then can we take this algorithm and can we apply it to different clinical populations? That's another part of this sort of modular processing. Like, can we look at this and can we apply it elsewhere? That's different sort of clinical validation of the same measure. And I think we would all benefit by sort of parsing out those three different pieces. The generation of that sample data itself, the processing of that data based on a predetermined set of requirements, and then how does that play in different clinical populations?
Just to riff off a little further, I think from a data science perspective, the key message to take is it's important to capture the breadcrumb or the history of how the data was generated. There is no way in the real world we can sort of control on how you get the data because things keep changing. HealthKit, for example, people can enroll into any number of devices that are HealthKit compatible and you will get more data than you expected. But to capture which device, the OS version, and etc. is super important because all of these play a big confounding role in the analysis phase.